In this presentation, we are going to consider how do you preserve food to be stored for all year when you can't buy or sell. While there are a number of different methods available and worth considering, this presentation is going to focus on water bath canning. Before we do that, we're going to take a look at different methods that are commonly used to preserve food. Root cellars and cool storage is a method that can make it possible to store food for a long period of time with little or no preparation done to the fruits or vegetables. This only works for some things, for instance, potatoes and raw apples of certain kinds. Because the cold storage or root cellar is cool temperature all the time and dry, the produce can last in its raw state for quite a long time. This method was commonly done in the turn of the century when there was not refrigeration available. Another method is drying or dehydrating. This can be done with a fruit dryer like shown here, or if you're not being able to buy or sell situation doesn't afford you the electricity to run this, you can dry fruits and vegetables by setting them on trays and either put them out in the sun, which is the method for sun-dried tomatoes, by the way, or you could, in the winter or rainy days, you could put them over a wood stove or hang them above the wood stove and they would dehydrate. Another method, which is very common, is water bath canning, and that's what we're going to focus on later in this presentation with my guest, Patty. Another option is pressure canning. This is often done for certain kinds of vegetables. It is a little more dangerous than water bath canning, so there are some cooks who prefer not to do pressure canning, but it can be done with care and proper equipment. Juicing is another option. We're going to look at several methods of doing juicing. Cold pressing is one. A familiar example is a cider press. You take the raw apples and you put them in the bin and you squeeze them, and the juice comes out and the pulp remains. This method, a steamer juicer, unlike the press, requires the use of heat. So you would have this unit sitting on a stove, and in these different layers you have water, and you have a steam that is made from the water, and then juice comes out on the tube, in the tube, and it works really good for doing grapes, I can tell you that. For some things, freezing is my favorite, be that blueberries or fruit or vegetables for that matter, corn, beans, string beans. The problem is when you're considering sustainability and being able to function with this method when you can't buy or sell, you would have to have a method of generating electricity when you can't buy or sell. That means you're not going to be running a generator. So let's say, for instance, you had a solar system set up to generate electricity. You would need to have one that could generate and store enough electricity year-round, including dark days of winter, to be able to sustain the needs of the house plus the freezer. So this can be problematic because if you had 3 or 4 days in a row in the middle of winter when there wasn't enough electricity to run the freezer, you could lose all of your food in the freezer. Freeze drying is another option. The problem with this from a sustainable perspective is a freeze dryer is a fairly expensive machine, and it requires quite a bit of electricity because it is literally a freezer. So it's probably not a very good choice from a no buy, no sell scenario. Another method of preparing food for long-term storage is fermenting vegetables. An example of this that we're familiar with is taking cabbage and turning it into sauerkraut. This method was very common back in the pioneer days because it didn't require a lot of work in terms of heat or refrigeration or anything like that. Pickling is a method that can be done to many kinds of vegetables and other kinds of edibles. We think of pickles when we think of the word pickling, which is taking a cucumber and pickling it. But you can pickle just about anything from peppers to boiled eggs. I'm now going to introduce my friend who has a great deal of experience with preserving food with various methods. And today she's going to explain from her personal experience and her research the reasons for and the ways to go about water bath canning, including the equipment you would need and the process of doing it.
Hello everybody, we will be talking about canning today. Canning starts with food. As you think about what fruit trees you will be planting, make sure that you plan how you will be processing the fruit. Apple trees, you have over. That means putting them in baskets or any containers that you choose and putting them in a cool, dark place. Or you have soft apples that when the tree is ripe, you have to process those apples within a few weeks. Cherries are more time consuming than larger fruits such as peaches or nectarines. Each one has to be pitted, but in the end, the amount of fruit you get is not the same for the work. Blueberries I like to use for many different things. You pick them, you wash them, you dehydrate them, and you put them in a container. Very minimal effort on blueberries. They're an easy one to do. If planting peaches or plum trees, make sure that your tree is what's called a freestone versus a cling. When you cut into the fruit and the stone inside comes out easily. With a cling fruit, the fruit is adhered to the stone. This is a very good thing to know when you're canning. You do not want to cling fruit to try to can them. They're good for eating, but very difficult in canning. You can Google trees in your area to find out what are the best fruits that grow, and you also want disease resistant. Now we go on to the canning. What equipment is needed to can? The number one thing I say is you need a canning book. I have a Ball Blue book. I just bought it at Walmart. For around $8, I think. But it is a must-have. It has all the recipes that you need, and they're specific for canning, and it tells you the times of each recipe and how to can it. It has many charts in it for troubleshooting and other things that you need to know. So it's invaluable to have a hard copy and not just go on the internet and take anything. You need clean, unbent, rust-free rings. The ring screws are known as flats, jars, quart, pint, half pint, and then there's also jelly jars. I've used them all, and they're all fine for when you need a certain type of amount. You want to use quarts because lids or flats are the one thing you have to continually buy. You can reuse rings, you can reuse jars, canners, all of that, but the flats are what you need to have on hand. And a quart versus a pint or even a half pint per flat doesn't help with the food preservation. So tongs for handling hot, clean lids or a magnetic lid lifter. A jar that's both liquid and dry. Timers, and I say timers because you need more than one. If your garden and your fruit trees all become ripe at the same time, if you have the ability to have two stations set up with people canning at each, you need more than one set of equipment. And at that time, it's all hands on deck. You need everybody to help. You need large, deep saucepans, 6 to 8 quart. Sharp paring and chopping knives. And I've added a steel in with this because you need to keep your knives sharp. They will be your best. Sharpen them. Don't let them become dull. That will be invaluable. A jar funnel, ladle, and more than one ladle is needed. Non-metallic utensil for removing bubbles from jars, such as a rubber spatula, hot pads, boiling water canner, and the boiling water canner comes with a lid and a rack. And you can also buy racks separately if you want to have an extra one on hand. And a 20 bath canner will hold an average of 7 quart jars. A pressure canner, if you're going to use pressure canner, that would be the same as the 21 quart water bath canner. It would hold also 7 quart jars. Long handled slotted spoons, a metal steamer or basket for blanching, a colander, a food mill for saucing, large bowls, and large bowls are very large bowls. You want something bigger than a mixing bowl that you would mix a cake in. You want very large bowls, and I would say at least 5. And most of this list you already have, and what you don't have in your kitchen, you can easily find on the internet or at a local store. So we get into how to can and why you can. You'll only water bath foods that are naturally high in pH of 4.6 or lower. These foods are fruits, soft spreads such as apple, pear, or peach butters, tomatoes, pickled foods, and other acidified foods. All foods that are low acid need to be pressure canned. Low acid need to be pressure canned. So, to can, we need the jars. Visually examine your jars for defect or damage that would prevent their use, such as a chip on the very top of the jar or a crack in the jar. If there's a crack, it will break open during the water bath time and resulting in loss of food. Then you wash your jars in hot soapy water and rinse them well. The jars to can need to be heated for 10 minutes before being filled to prevent breakage during the processing time. How you do this is you submerge your jars and bring the water to a simmer, and you maintain that until you're ready to fill and can your jars. Some people go with the dishwasher method of cleaning and heating their jars, but that will only work during the time that you can buy and sell. But doing that, you would just keep the door closed and remove one at a time and keep all the heat in the dishwasher. Lids and bands. You choose the appropriate size of lid or flat and band for the jar that you're using. And what I mean by this is you have wide mouth jars and you have small mouth jars. So you need to have the correct lid and band to go with the jars you're filling. So I have used both. I like both. The wide mouth are a little easier if you're doing fruit that's larger, such as peach halves or pears. Fine. You wash your lids and bands in hot soapy water. You don't use anything abrasive on them, because if you do, you can scratch their coating, and you don't want to do that. You put the lids into a pan of hot water. You do not boil the lids. Because they have a rubber gasket on them, and you don't want that to soften too much. You're heating them. It will kill bacteria, and it will soften them some, but you don't want them over softened. At this time, you start your water canner heating. It takes a while to bring water up to temperature, and you want to have it ready for when you're ready to process your food. Then you also put another pot of water on, and you bring that to a boil, and then you turn it down to a simmer, and that you'll be using later. So the tomatoes. We're going to do a water pack, raw pack, or it's called cold pack. You prep the tomatoes, you wash them, you cut anything off that should be with a knife, and then you put them into blanch in boiling water for 30 to 60 seconds. Depending on your pot you can put in 4 or 5 tomatoes at a time. Then after this 30 to 60 seconds, you immediately take them out and transfer them to cold water. Everybody recommends ice water, but in the no-buy-no-sell time, cold water will do it. You're just trying to stop that, helps you handle the fruit. Once you put them in the cold water, you can peel off the skin. That's called slipping the skin. And your tomatoes, because you cut an X on them, it makes it easier to peel the skin off or slip the skin. Cut it and put it in a large bowl. And then you continue doing your tomatoes till you fill your bowl and are ready to can. What I have also done after slipping skins is I've started dehydrating the skins. They're clean. You grew them. They're organic. I have dehydrated them, and then once they're dehydrated, I have put them in a food processor and turned them to powder, and I've used that in my soup stocks or in other cooking food that it just adds another element of taste. And in the no buy and sell situation, you really don't want to throw any food away. You want to make sure that everything that you can eat, you have on hand to eat. Then you take your quart jar out of the water, and into it you put 2 tablespoons of bottled lemon juice. Or if you're using citric acid, use half a teaspoon citric acid. At this point, you can add 1 teaspoon of salt, which is totally optional. The salt does not do anything for the preservation of the tomatoes. You always have to add acid in tomatoes. I looked up citric acid or lemon juice, and there aren't any. They said, without a doubt, always use it. So lemon juice is not shelf stable. It can go bad, it can spoil, and if you have it in your refrigerator or a cool area, it still will go bad if it's not used up. So during the no buy no sell time, I recommend trying the citric acid. It is a powder. It would be shelf stable, and you really would not need to keep it refrigerated or worry about it going bad and leaving you without an acid to can your tomatoes. Now we can pack the tomatoes into the jar that you've put the acid in, and you pack it up to the top, but you leave 1/2 inch headspace. To get that measure, you start at the rim, which is the top of the jar, and you measure down. Once you have the jar filled to that point, you will ladle tomatoes, and you will still maintain that 1/2 inch headspace. Next, you're going to remove any air bubbles. Even if you don't see any, this step needs to be done every single time because you do not want air trapped in your jar because it could allow for mold or growth of bacteria. So to do this, you take your non-metallic spatula or tool and you put it between the food and the side of the jar. You gently food to release the trapped air. And you want to do that all the way around the jar. And then you've released all the air that's been trapped. Then you use a damp, clean, lint-free cloth to wipe the rim of the jar. And that removes anything that might prevent a seal, such as if a tomato seed got on there or juice or pulp, and that could prevent your seal from happening. I have towels that I specifically keep just for that, and I use a cotton towel that is lint-free. Using tongs, then, you lift, or a lid lifter, you remove the lid from the hot water and center it on the jar. You adjust the band or ring to fingertip tight. So what is fingertip tight? Fingertip tight is just till you feel resistance as you turn it. This will allow for any air bubbles that are trapped in the jar to escape during the processing time. Because if you've missed any air bubbles through the top before the seal is sealed, it will cause your flap to buckle. Then place the jar on the rack that's elevated over your simmering water in your canner. And your canner comes with the rack, and the rack is designed to sit on each side of the canner as you put the jars in. You repeat all of these steps with each jar until you have your canner filled. Then you lower the rack into the simmering water. The water must cover the jars by 1 inch. And sometimes I add more water, hot water in. I like to have it a little higher. So you cover the canner with the lid, and you bring the water to a rolling boil. And once you have it at a rolling boil, you process your quart jars for 45 minutes. Always set your timer. Always. Because if your attention is diverted or you forget what time you come to a boil, you don't want to have to start over. And then at this point, you also need to know the altitude that you're at. Because whatever altitude you're at, if you're higher than 1,001 feet to 3,000 feet, you add 5 minutes. If you're 3,000, 5 minutes. If you're 3,000 feet to 6,000, you add 10 minutes onto your cooking time. And the chart in your book goes on up, but that will help you to know what altitude time you're at for processing. So turn off your heat, you take off the cover, and you let the jars cool for 5 minutes. Using a jar lifter, you lift the jar out of the canner and put it on a towel that you've laid on your counter. And you may notice that the ring is loose. Don't tighten it, just leave it. Don't take it off, just leave it. You don't want to tighten it back up. So then you have your jars on the towel, and once all the jars are out of the canner, I lay another towel over the top of them. And sometimes when you pull a jar out of the canner, you'll hear it pop immediately when it hits the air, and that you really want that. That's a good thing. But you'll hear them start to pop, and it can happen immediately or it can take an hour. And I've read it can take even up to 24 hours. I've never had a jar take that long to seal, but in the book it said that it can take up to 24 hours. How to check to make sure that you have a seal. You do this by pressing the top of the lid, and if the lid pops up and down or moves, you do not have a seal. You can reprocess unsealed jars by taking the lid off. You can wash that lid or get a different one and wipe the rim of your jar. Check it over again to make sure there's not a chip in the ring or the rim. And then you would just do just eat the food. I've done that. Just stick it in the fridge and eat it through the week instead of reprocessing. Now, how do you check for food spoilage? So some of the signs for spoilage are broken seals. That's pretty obvious. You have the popping up and down of the lid. Mold, you can see that. Gassiness, I suppose when you open it, you hear a hissing. Cloudiness, you look in the jar and if it's real cloudy. Spurting liquid, and I'm thinking that when it spurts out. Seepage, then you know that your seal isn't good. Yeast growth, and that would probably be obvious to your eyes. Fermentation, lots of bubbles coming up. Sliminess on the food and bad odors. Sliminess on the food and bad odors when you open it. Anything like that you want to dispose of. You never taste directly from the jar anything that even remotely looks like any of this. The things that I just read, So then to store your food, you take a Sharpie. I use a Sharpie and I write the date on the leaves, or if it's corn, you know it's corn. But if you're not sure, go ahead and write what it is. You take the ring off. You never store your jars with the ring on. And then you have the rings for canning other produce. So then you put your jars in a dark, cool place. And when I store my jars, my husband built me a shelf down in our basement, and I make sure that each jar has a little bit of airflow around them. I never have my jars touching. Some people have their jars touching, but I suppose it's a personal preference. But I always have a little bit of room around them. And the shelves, he also built a little ledge, or he put like a slat across the opening of the shelf, so that if we had an earthquake, which we did, and I did not lose any of my canning off the edge. So that is a good thing to have. You really don't want to lose your food if there's an earthquake. Now that we have a good understanding of some of the process of canning, we'll talk about the canning process for water bath canning over wood heat is the same as it would be on a stove. I'm going to go with the process of a wood heat, that there's not any power, wood heat. The only difference is the fire underneath. You still bring the water to a boil. You still time it. You have to make sure that you have plenty of wood on hand, because you don't want to run out of wood and have the fire start to die while you're timing your water bath. And you want to make sure you don't have green wood. You want nice dry wood, because the smoke would be a lot. A wood burning stove would be the easiest, and you would have one outside for canning. Would be ideal to have a canning shed. So if that could be done, that would be really nice to have, because it's so hot in your house. So I also saw on YouTube people canning with an open water bath canner over a campfire. They took cinder blocks, they stacked them up, and they put a grate across the top and built a fire under the grate. Then the canner was set on top of the grate, and once it came to a boil, you do it the amount of time. If it's 45 minutes, that's what you time, and it's done. So that looked pretty easy. Done over wood heat. The hardest part for the people doing it was maintaining constant heat. Their fire got too hot, so they had to use a steel plate to go between the fire and the canner to try to control the heat. And then they had to make sure that when using that the heat didn't drop too much, because then they would lose pressure. And once you drop in pressure, you have to bring it back to pressure and start your timing all over again. This method is doable. You need to practice, and it's best to practice all of this when there is buying and selling, so that you know if there's something that you need or you need some help, you can get it. Just to be sure that when the time comes, you're ready. We all need to prepare as much as possible. God will be with us, and He will help our gardens grow. Since the sunshine, we'll have the rain, and we just need to know how to prepare the food. So I hope you enjoy your food.